things first, keyboard animations. You know, how do we move elements around? How you move elements around the screen when the keyboard animates seems like an elementary idea, but it's really not that easy. And for people who have played with apps that have a lot of data entry or something, and this is like a chat or a messaging app, you know, a chat or a messaging plugin. This is a one-screen thing. There are no additional view controllers loading or anything. It's just one screen. You know, how you mess with the UI when the keyboard opens and closes is not that. It's not that easy to understand. So if you've got a view that you've animated down, like this is like a scorekeeping app. And so if you've got a view that you're using to play with scores, and then you want to type something, right? How we move these things around is not that easy. So we're going to talk about that. You know, I just talked about animating additional views around our plugin. You know, plugins are not confined to one view. They have a base view controller. They have a base view controller that's kind of the foundation for your plugin. But in this case, there's lots of views around this view controller. So I just showed you one. I'm pulling down from the top and sliding back up. That's a whole other view.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
You know.
Sue, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. He maybe can't hear us.
I got no audio.
Oh, I'll type a message to him, okay? He can't hear us.
Okay. So anyway, so we have another view on top of this plugin view, this view controller that we're animating down from the top. That is, it's kind of cool, right? So how do we do that? It's not that big of a deal, but how we do it, some people I'm learning are having a really hard time understanding this stuff. So we'll talk about additional views. And by the way, along the bottom, this little keyboard view, that's a view that I made. And when I tap on the keyboard, I'm not just exposing, I mean, when I tap on the data entry box, I'm not just exposing the keyboard, I'm moving this view above it along with this is scrolling and moving, right? This is opening and closing. It's a little bit tricky. So we're going to talk about that. Speech bubbles, we'll get to that in just a sec. UI table view cells. This list is a table view. It's a table view, and if you'll notice, each row is a different height. Right? If I added another row here, this is another row. It certainly doesn't need to be as high as the last row I added, right? So the variable height of UI table cell rows is a challenge. It's a challenge. You know, most tables have the same height for each row. But in a situation like a texting app or a messaging app, that's not going to work. You know, you might have a lot of text in one and a little text in another, and so you have to have a way to dynamically determine those rows while also being able to have a lot of performance, right? You got to think about if there's 500 rows, it's still got to scroll fast. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Speech bubbles. Right here we have these speech bubbles. You know, the green, the image that's stretching around the text. Personally, I think that's a little old school. I don't really like the speech bubbles, but a lot of people do, and so there's some strategy in terms of, you know, how you do that and how you position those elements. There's a lot going on in each one of these rows. We've got a graphic for the person, which is just a generic blank one now. We've got a little timestamp here that should be formatted to something friendly. We've got a variable height label, and then we have a stretched image around that label. I see it's kind of backwards with, I think this little arrow should be at the top, but that's just a project. So we'll talk about that. And all of that, you know, to me is kind of the easy part. The one thing that we're going to talk about that I didn't put on this agenda here, oh yeah, here it is, UI text views. This box down here that I type in, most of us would recognize this as like a one-line entry box. This is an entry box. But what happens when I type more than one line? What happens when I keep on typing? iOS does not automatically grow this box, right? It adds scroll bars to it. So if we've all messed with a text view, they're a fixed size, and they have scrollers in them as the content adds. Well, in a messaging situation, that's lame. You know, we need it to grow while we type. And so this is a non-trivial problem when you're trying to build an app that has this thing. Because look what's happened here. This view has grown. The height of this has grown. The table above it's got to move. Right? It's pretty complicated. what happens when I bring down my view now from the top? Remember we had our little score thing? What if the user pulls down our little score view and then pulls it back up? You know, while there's text in there, do you want to erase that? There's all these little considerations that you have to think about when you're creating these apps. And then it has to, of course, get small again when it's not being used. All right, so we want to talk about what are some of the strategies to make the UI professional. And we're all used to it. When we use apps that we really like, they do these things that only become, you know, the kind of the skill level that you only begin to recognize it when you try to make it yourself. And you're like, wow, how did they do that? This is crazy. But without it, it's just really ghetto. I mean, imagine a texting app where it would only allow you one line. You know, that would just be bogus. It just wouldn't good. It just wouldn't be good. So that's what we're going to talk about. It is about 105. Like I said, each of these concepts is complicated. And so most of this is going to be you listening and just kind of seeing how I approach these problems. There's lots of strategies for lots of these problems. Of course, Stack Overflow, Google, you can Google it all. But really what you're going to find is you've got multiple problems all in one screen. You know, it's one thing to make a stretchable text field. It's another thing to make a speech bubble. It's another thing to animate, you know, a top screen, you know, a view on top of your plugin. But doing that all in one is when it really starts to get complex. And we've kind of tackled all of that in one plugin. And so, yeah, it'll be a fun conversation. So let's look at, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to relaunch this simulator with no messages in our view, right? Our little agenda is gone. So this is what a texting or chatting app might look like when it first loads, if there weren't anything, right? You might have a graphic there that says no messages. But really, that's not the case, right? Because when you launch a text message app, it's probably going to go to some back end somewhere and pull messages from a remote location, populate the view, and then you would keep adding to it. So, I mean, the only time it's going to be blank is like the first time the conversation first started. So in this case, if we had a blank conversation, it would look something like this. You know, this is the first message, something like that. And so you would just add to it, and then you would send that to your back end, and then the app on the other end would get that message and download it to there. So what we're going to do is use a simple little script, and I'm going to output, just to show you that the performance is there, I'll output 100 messages. You will see that our DB, David Book, this is called DB Score, by the way. It's just kind of a little scorekeeping screen I'm working on. We're going to go and we're going to download data from a URL, which we're all used to. It's a little development box I have. And we're going to hit a PHP script, which is right here. It's a very simple script. It's not going to the database. It's just 100 messages in a loop. And we're going to output 100 messages so that when the app first launches, we have 100 messages on the screen. And again, this will demonstrate some some simple little problems that don't seem so simple. So let's relaunch it. It'll go grab those 100. I don't have a refresh button or whatever. So now we have these 100 messages on our screen. And one of the first things you'll notice is the last message, well, 99, I guess, because I'm going from 0 to 100. But you'll notice that the last message is at the bottom and in view. Right? That's not how a typical table works. A table normally just adds it to the bottom and you wouldn't see it. But in a messaging situation, you need to see the last message. So all of the messages above it are scrolled up. So scrolling a table view to the bottom is kind of a trivial thing to do. But what happens when I go to make the next message? Right? Well, first off, you see how fast this is scrolling. There's 100 messages here, and they all scroll pretty quick. And if I do this, if I add some messages with some variable length height, and notice they're gray, by the way, they're not green because it's assumed that these messages were not written by me. They were from somebody else, so I would be green and the other person would be somebody else. You'll notice that the variable height here, see how that last one's got a lot of text? Still works pretty good. So my messages would be green. Because I wrote the green ones. You know, that's just the logic that I worked out. So we've got a couple of different things going on. But back to this scrolling idea and this animation idea. When I tap in this text field, I need to do a couple of different things. If I'm scrolled into the middle of my list, the first thing I need to do is scroll this up so that my message will show when I'm done typing it. The next thing we need to do is we need to take the whole table, the whole list, and move it up. Because if we just scroll to the bottom, that wouldn't be good enough. Our keyboard would cover that up. Right? Our list is down here at the bottom of this keyboard. So we're scrolling to the end of the list, and we're moving the whole frame up the screen at the same time as soon as I tap in this box. And then when I send a message, we're doing the same thing. We're bringing the table back, we're resetting the position of the table. That's kind of the trick there. People they struggle, like they'll say, I'm moving the frame, but it won't scroll, or they'll say, I'm scrolling to the end, but I can't see it because my keyboard covers it up. That's because they're not moving the frame up the view. And then, of course, how high do you move it? Right? Do you move it 97 pixels because that's the height of the keyboard? Well, what if I have a special keyboard on my iPhone with emoticons and all kinds of other crazy stuff? All of a sudden, the standard keyboard height isn't going to be good enough. So we have to calculate the height of the keyboard that the user's using, add the height of our view that we've stuck on top of it with our send button, calculate the size of the screen itself, and then, and only then, can we determine where to place our table. So these little things seem simple, but they're not that simple. They're really not. And so that's what we've done here. And so let's go back and just put a few messages on here instead of these crazy long ones. Let me get back end going because I just wanted to demonstrate that. And we'll just put like 3 on here. And then we'll dive into some code and I'll show you how I set this up. Okay, so we've got 3 messages from somebody else, and then my message would be the 4th. And you could see that, you know, we could make huge improvements in terms of how this is laid out, but that's not what this is about. So this project that I'm working on is a generic blank Buzztouch project with one plugin. It's called DB Score. If we look at my configuration file for my project, you'll see that there's one screen. It's called DB Score, and you'll see that there's almost no settings, right? It's just got an item ID. I can make that anything I want. The plugin type, the item type is DB Score. That's the view controller we're going to load. And then the nickname. So I'm going to go to the DB Score view controller. This is our, in essence, this is our plugin. And we're going to show you, let me move this here. I like looking at you guys while I talk, and I can't figure out how to get your faces to quit disappearing. I can probably always on top or something. But anyway, so I'm going to show you what properties and methods and things we've implemented in the Score plugin to make all of this work. So this is the Score's interface. This is the Score's implementation. This is the Score's nib file, which is very basic. We've got additional classes here for each row, each message in the list. We've got additional classes here for the growing text view, right? And then we have some images. We've got the scorecard that you saw, the header, the big one that you saw. We've got the balloons that stretch right and left for the messages, another header, the background for the entry box, and then the default person. So these are all in the plugin package. You can see that I've named all the file names with my initials, DB. Have prefixed all the file names, so everything in my plugin has kind of belongs to this folder, which is cool. And let's just look at the interface for this list view first, and we'll talk about all these properties and methods. So some of you might be looking at this and you might be saying, wow, there's a lot of properties here. There looks like there's about 15. Or wow, there's a lot of methods here. It looks like there's about 8 methods. And some of you might be saying, you know what, that's pretty simple. There aren't that many. Because really, there aren't that many. However, there are a lot of additional things that I had to do in these other classes that have their own methods and their own properties. And so there's quite a bit more going on here than it might seem on the surface. But that's good, right? Your plugin class file, your view controller doesn't have to be that complicated. So we have a UI view called Score Details. That's a property, and that view is this view here. This is this big thing that slides down as Score Details. We have a downloader because remember when the screen first loaded, we needed to download the messages. We have an array of message items, right? 1 item, 2 item. Each item in the list is what loads our list. We've got some little, I call them little flags here, you know, did initialize and is loading. These are little helpers as, you know, you don't want to refresh all the time, stuff like that. This comments view frame, this is kind of tricky, but really the default comments view frame, that refers to the size of this frame around the keyboard and the view on top. I just remembered it in a property, so I don't have to keep recalculating the size of the user's keyboard and whatnot. I can just grab the size of the keyboard at one time, remember it in this property, and then refer to it later when we're doing things like closing the box or animating things around. So that's what that property is. Our image header, that's this orange image here. Yeah, I'm cheating a little bit in that the period and the time and the date and the actual scores. Right now this is just an image. Theoretically that could be its own, needs to be its own view with little labels for the scores and all that kind of stuff as things change. But right now it's just a background image to show you how I've done this. And oftentimes that's how I do my development. I make an image that represents what I'm trying to accomplish. And then I look at that image and I say, okay, I need a label, I need a button, you know, I need an image, a graphic for the pointer. You know, once you have the design, you can really be much faster. So this is our image header. I've got another image here called a view header swipe. It's kind of a weird little cryptic name, but the view header swipe view is actually a blank view that doesn't have any content in it. And I've placed it right on top of these numbers. You can't see it, it's just transparent. Because I needed something to grab and swipe down to bring this scoreboard down. I didn't want to attach it to this whole view, the whole header, because as we all know, iOS has its own built-in thing at the very top that you can slide down. So I needed a way to allow the user to swipe down my scoreboard without having to go all the way to the top of the screen and swipe it down, because I didn't want them opening the message center. I wanted them opening the scoreboard. And so I made a blank little view here and just stuck it on top of these numbers. And the reason I needed to put that view there is I then added a gesture recognizer, a swipe gesture recognizer to that little blank box. So that's how I did that. So that's called the view header swipe down. And then there's a button, open score details. Actually, I don't think I'm using this button. I had a button. Oh, yeah, I am using it. So if I click on the score, this comes down, or if I swipe on the score. So just depending on how the user wants to interact. So there's a button in that exact same spot that's blank, has no content, just an invisible button, so I could put a click event on it. I could have trapped a click event on the view, but it's easier to do it with a button. So that's kind of the top section, the properties. And then we have a UI table view, the messages, right? That's this table view that we're all so used to. We've got a view here holding what that I've called the view comments box, UI view. That is this view here with the silver background and the send button on it. This little 320 by 7, by 60 high view. That's that view, and it grows too with the text view as I type. But I needed a property for that, so that's a view. The camera button and the send button, actually, there is no camera button. I had a camera button in this text field. I never really got to that point, but you might want to add a picture to the message or whatever. That's beyond. There's just so many different things you can do with messaging, but so I can get rid of this camera button property. And then the send button, we all know what the send button is. That's this button. And then here's an interesting one. We have a property called text comments that is not a UI text view. It's not a UI text view because if I used a UI text view, it wouldn't grow for me automatically. Remember, the UI text view's got scroll bars and all that kind of stuff. So I created my own UI text view, and I named it David Book Growing Text View, which is just a UI text view that's subclass, this subclass is the text view, and it's magic, and it knows when things are happening to it, and it knows how to grow itself. So the property type is not UI text view, it's David Book Growing Text View. So that's this class right here. Right? And it's a whole other class that has to know all kinds of things about itself. We're not really going to get into the details of how that works, but I wanted you to see how I did what I did. Right? I made a property with the type of a class that I made. That's part of my plugin. It's in my plugin package, but it's not part of the view controller, if that makes sense. So in order to use the growing text view, I had to write some code. You'll notice here that the David Book growing text view is a view that extends the UI text view delegate. And so it's a custom box that I made that feels like a text view. Anyway, that's how that works. And then I also had to make a message cell, right? Same thing, that extends the UI table view cell, because we all know that standard generic table view cells don't have, you know, bubbles and variable heights and all these kinds of things. So I had to extend the table view. And you'll see when we make the rows for our table that I used my David Book message cell. It's just what I call this, and it's got, you know, a few properties, a time and an avatar and a message and a balloon, that kind of stuff. And incidentally, if I go to my, I'm going to rebuild this one more time. I'm going to go to my score, and I'm going to go to table views, the cell for row at index path, and you'll see here that we're saying don't get a normal UI table view cell. You know, don't use one of these generic iOS things. Use my cool one, my David Book message cell. So we've got a cool David Book text box, we've got a cool David Book message cell, and we're using those in our plugin to demonstrate that this is all one view controller, but it feels super legit because it's all packaged up and used like we want. So if we look at the message cell, just for fun here, this is where we're setting the balloons, you know, balloon right, balloon left. These are our images. That's where the stretchable balloon goes around that. And then we run a little method called layout subviews that actually sets up that balloon, you know, go get the image for the balloon. If I comment this out, I think it looks better in these days of iOS 7. I think it looks cool without the balloons. That's just my hunch. And you can see that when our messages load, you know, they just look better to me. Now we would have to figure out a way to better indicate whether it's from me or the other guy. This is from me. Right now we just got them one on the left and one on the right, but remember our avatar would probably indicate that or something. And so in our control panel we might have a choice like, you know, show message balloons or something. No, yes. I think that looks goofy with them, but that's just me. It just feels old. It looked cool a few years ago, but today it feels like it looks better without them. Anyway, so that's a message cell. So back to our score. I got a little tangent there. We've got, what, 7 methods. They're all the same methods we're all used to. Load the data, refresh the data, download the data, lay out the screen, you know, parse the data after you download it, resign text view. You know, hey, what happens when I want to close the keyboard? You know, is it loading? These kinds of things. So these are our properties in our methods in our view controller. You might have noticed up here that we're also conforming to or listening for or adhering to, depending on what kind of words you want to use, these individual protocols. We're saying that the growing text view delegate has to be understood by this class file. The download delegate has to be understood. The table view delegate, the data source delegate. And most of us in this meeting already understand why, right? If we're saying that our view controller conforms to the UI table view delegate protocol, we know that our code's got to provide things like number of rows, cell for row at index path, you know, things like this. We know that. So the same thing can be said for the delegate that I made for the growing text view, right? Our controller has to know what to do when it starts growing and when it starts shrinking. So we are telling our view controller that we're going to listen to those delegate methods. Same thing for the downloader, right? Hey, when I'm done downloading, what do you want me to do? That kind of stuff. So let's go on to the .m. You'll see that it's about 675 lines long. It's not that bad. Most of the stuff that we see in there is just like all the other things that we see in all these other plugins. But I'm going to walk down the code real fast until we get to the point of setup, and then we'll jump around a little bit. So the first thing we all recognize is because we have a nib file, the UI parts of the nib are going to be loaded first. So that's this top view here, right? And then remember I told you I had a view for the swipe. You can see how big that view is here. And you can see that there's a button right on top of that view. And if we look at our little inspector panel, you can see that the image header is connected to the file's owner. I'll just do this again to kind of show you. The image header is connected to the file's owner image header property. The swipe view is connected to the file's owner view header swipe. And remember, that's possible because in our interface, we told the interface builder that these are interface builder outlets, right? The image view for the header, the swiper, they're outlets, so we can make these connections in interface builder. We could have absolutely done this without interface builder, but I've done a mixture of both to kind of demonstrate how you do this stuff. So, yeah, so we have a very basic interface builder file, but you'll notice there's no table on it, there's no text box at the bottom, right? There's really nothing on it. It's just kind of generic. It's basically a view for the, it holds the top. That's all it is. So the rest of that stuff must be added in code. So let's see how we've done that. So let's go to our .m. At this point right here in view did load, iOS has already unpacked that nib file and made a view out of it with those components. But now we are adding all this other stuff. So the score details, that's this box here. I got to build that, right? So you can see here that we made it, it's an image view that holds our header image. And then below that, we made another image view that holds our score large. There's actually 1, 2, 3 images here. If you look at the resources, you've got 1, 2, where's the third one? 3. So they're kind of stacked up, one on top of the other. And the reason I did them separately like that, whoops, where'd you guys go? There you are. The reason I did that separately like that is because ultimately I'm going to be interacting with this. I'm going to be flipping the score, right? It's a score app that I can message with. And so I needed to separate these into 3 different views. Right now they're image views. Later I'll change them into other kinds of views that I can manipulate. Anyway, so I've added those to the screen. If I add this one to the screen, with the add subview, I've made a frame. X 0, Y 0. The width of it is the frame of the whole view. 63 is the height. If you were to open up this picture in Photoshop, you would see that it's 63 pixels high. And then the details view. And so this section right here is just adding those images. But look at the trick here. Look at that Y value, minus 352. Remember, when our plugin first loaded, you can't see that. So it's added to the view controller, but it's off the screen above everything. So that's why I said minus 352 pixels high, because I know that this thing is 352 pixels tall. And I know that when I tap that button, I'm going to run a little animation method that's going to make that 352 turn to 0. And it's going to slide on down to 0. 0 being right here in the top left. I'm pointing at the simulator like you guys can see. The top left would be 0, 0. So this is the number that I'm manipulating when we animate it up and down. The Y value of that box is going up and down. That's it. Everything else about it stays the same. Its width and its height and all that is unchanged. But the Y goes to negative 352, which is off the screen, down to 352. So that's how that works. You'll see that I've added my swipe gesture recognizer, and I've added that to the header. I got to have one to swipe up, and I got to have one to swipe down. Right? So I've got a swipe down recognizer and a swipe up recognizer. And then we got to build our table. I'm calling that the table messages. That's a classic UI table view. Starts out empty, no rows, right? I did give it a row height of 80 pixels per row, but I already know that that's going to be calculated with each row because they're all different, but I just gave it a number just because. And remember, when you're developing, you don't quite figure out these problems, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, the row height doesn't matter because I'm going to need to do that later. And I told it the data source is this controller and the delegate is this controller. This is all very standard stuff. And then I build the view. This is a pretty complicated one. I build the view holding our keyboard. Remember, our keyboard down here is a keyboard. The keyboard I didn't build, but the box above the keyboard I built. So when the keyboard moves up, I got to move my view up. When the keyboard moves down, I got to move my view down. So I had to build a view for that. And you can see that it's got the background art, right? The message input field, that's just background art. That's how you get the rounded corners on a text view, right? Remember, UI text views aren't round. There's all these weird little tricks. So I built the view holding the keyboard, the entry. This is where I could mess with the camera button and add a camera button or whatever, stuff like that. And probably clicking a camera button would slide open another alert that says, you know, choose a picture, take a picture, on and on and on. Maybe you want to do doodle art, or, you know, you've just used all the messaging apps. Maybe you want to share something, you know, who knows. Okay, then this is an interesting one. I listen for some notifications. iOS will broadcast all kinds of notifications to us if we want to listen to them. So I wanted to listen to a notification when the keyboard was about to show. And then I wanted to listen for a notification for when the keyboard was about to hide. And the reason I did that is I know